I don't really care that there's aliens or where they come from. I mean, the prize is the technology, and it's something that they seem to take out every 8 or 10 years.
So stumble into a problem, this happens, they put the technology away, and then they bring it back out and see if material science has caught up and if they can make any progress.
Try and do what we can, and once we reach a roadblock and we really can't figure it out, it's just friggin' wait, put the thing away, wait for science to catch up, and, a decade later, let's take the project out again. And
any idea of where they got them or how they got them?
From Barry. But it was just too long ago, and I can't quite remember what was said, but it just left a seed in my mind. I think at least one of them was part of an archaeological dig. So it's old. At least one of them is old. I don't know if it was the one I worked on, but I remember something to do with an archaeological dig.
Whoa.
So that means it's not just old, it's ancient.
It could be a great Steven Spielberg movie.
Yeah.
Right?
It actually is. Okay, so let's say you have this ancient culture of 13,000 years ago, and they even have their type of aircrafts, like we do, except for theirs are a lot different. They're more like this. This is from Independence Day. Or something like the Millennium Falcon, or something like the Baltic Sea Anomaly, or Bob Lazar's spacecraft. Now, the people from our past went and dug up their ancient past, which is basically our ancient past too, just twice as long ago. So after all this flooding occurs, things start drying up. And of course, a lot of the lush area is gone. Salt seeds and lays everywhere and destroys any kind of potential for. And ultimately, this culture is buried for a long time. So they went and dug it back up. And then, of course, the Pharaoh tries to reactivate these and causes plagues and stuff because he doesn't know what he's doing. It's like us digging these up and then trying to understand where they were coming from and what they were doing. The Pharaoh probably had a little bit more insight than we do because he would have a little bit more information than we would because he's closer to it. Like I said, we're twice as far away from this tech, or not tech, but this timeline. Now, the Vatican looks like a key, and X marks the spot here. But ultimately, we know this vault has all kinds of information in it, and probably even these craft. Now, the 7 ancient kings of Rome, but they were the kings. They were the elite. They were the highest. So these guys had information. They probably had vaults with relics in them that tied to this ancient past. They had insight. They had information. They knew certain things. They could read certain documents that nobody else was privy to. Now, this is the aerial battle of Nuremberg, Germany in 1561. Basically, there was these aircrafts, and it seems like they were fighting and burning up when they hit the ground. Now, if what Bob Lazar and Joe Rogan and everyone was speaking of, if that was true, then they had been pulling these things out for not only every couple decades or 10 years or something, but hundreds of years, thousands of years. They've been handed down and passed through the ages. And over time, they get kind of distributed around powers of the world. Now, the Knights Templar, they were sent to recover a lot of these relics. And of course, they were charged with witchcraft and murdered because they had information. Dead men tell no tales. Because basically, ultimately, they knew about the witchcraft because this would be considered witchcraft. This is crafts of witchery. Now, this is just a theory, but I believe the Tunguska event in 1908 was at some point they did this same thing. They pulled them out trying to work on them and did something wrong and caused an explosion. So Germany got out their relics in 1936, the Black Forest UFO incident. Of course, Hitler started working on them and trying to figure them out and design his own concepts and, the Nazi UFO situation. Of course, this led to the Holocaust. Of course, we got ours in 1947. Well, technically, we already had it because we're the Roman Empire and we came from Europe. Basically, just brought the stuff over. And now, 6 months after the Roswell crash, we finally designed the first transistor. It's technically a point contact transistor. This right here would be analogous to it's analogous to the King's Chamber right here. This would be the point contact, but I'm digressing. So from this design, 1948, the rotor comes out. And the rotor at 33 revolutions per second becomes basically the gravitron. Of course, Starship 2000, 3000, yada, yada, alien invasion, all of that stuff. Area 51 are all the names for it. Coincidentally, tell us without telling us. Of course, 3 years after that, we started getting an interest in space. And then in 1955, July 30th, the space race begins. And then, of course, the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union eventually allowed the U.S. and the newly found Russian Federation to end their Cold War competition also in space. Basically, all of this broke out. Of course, it ends in 1975, which is 20 years later. All of that's put to bed. But now you have the 70s after everything is pretty much over and they use everything up. Now the people get some. And they were putting this stuff into development for a little while before we got it. Just a couple years, a few years.
But tell me how the connection between aliens and the Nazis took place. When did all this start?
Let me say this.
No.
I'm not trying to take over, but 2 years ago, I'm not bullshitting you.
There it is, right there.
It was patented in 1957. It's a VR machine.
Exactly. No, exactly.
That's
crazy.
It's one reason we get these UFOs and these pictures, because like Bob Lazar explains, even if someone teleported a Harley back into the 1700s, they probably wouldn't know anything about it or what it is, but they'd probably be able to drive it eventually because it's designed for a human, and they're a human. They would, understand how to work it, but they just wouldn't understand that it runs on gas, it's got a combustion engine and valves and timing and all of that. We've been doing that since it's made for a pentamorph, which would be a UFO, or alien, like a, humanoid type figure. It's got 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, which is basically pentamorphic. Then we would probably be able to drive it as it should be driven, just not understand how it actually works. But when we started learning transistors and taking this technology, motherboards and transistors, that's why this looks like the pyramid complex, and it's called a complex. And pyramids use sockets just like a CPU does. But that ancient technology made its way into our modern times through ancient recorded tech, just ancient history, an ancient culture that went down and was dug up and has been carried through by the elites. And now it's more about monetary value, what they can gain off of it, and still give us small bits of it. That's why ours is micro tech. This is one reason static is bad for CPUs and any kind of circuitry, because this actually honed in static, created a scalar field, which was basically radio frequency with a nuclear push, and that was the nuclear room there at the King's Chamber, like our nuclear rooms and our nuclear reactors. A lot of people were killed throughout the history. Innocent people and wars and power, and wanting to know and have that. And just saying, the Chinese Empire, Asian Empire, because there's technically only 2, the European Empire and the Asian Empire, that exist anymore. They've been studying their pyramids, and they take them seriously. Now, obviously, I believe our government does the same thing, but they kind of sweep them under the rug. This is where the concept of Taoism comes from, understanding this ancient wisdom. I believe I just found this out right now. There's Alpha and Omega on the sarcophagi in the King's Chamber. But what I was getting at before I figured that out, or found that out just now, is the King's Chamber is the Alpha. That points towards Alpha Draconis. I've mentioned this before. And this is Beta Ursa Minor. That's Y and X. It's a nuclear room, and this is the electrical room. Basically, it's a giant thermoelectric transistor, superconductor, nuclear power plant, etc. Wireless radio transmitter, wireless receiver. It used thermodynamics.
So back to our power source. Inside the reactor, element 115 is bombarded with a proton, which plugs into the nucleus of the 115 atom and becomes element 116, which immediately decays and releases or radiates small amounts of antimatter. The antimatter is released in a vacuum into a tuned tube, which keeps it from reacting with the matter that surrounds it. It is then directed towards the gaseous matter target at the end of the tube. The matter and antimatter collide and annihilate, totally converting to energy. The heat from this reaction is converted into electrical energy in a near 100% efficient thermoelectric generator. This is a device that converts heat directly into electrical energy.
We just invented, or just figured out, heat control circuitry, which is thermal transistors. Like I mentioned before, thermoelectric transistors, well, a CPU gets hot, and it's made of transistors, and we use computer hardware in thermoelectric transistors, or thermoelectric generators. So they're obviously backwards compatible. That's why these motherboards are called MicroStar, because there was a MicroStar in the King's Chamber here. And of course you have BioStar, which is basically us. Now today, it's possible to squeeze billions of transistors onto a single chip, but this was just a giant transistor. Simple one, thermoelectric, but ultimately used solid state. Unlike we use ones and zeros, this thing could emit a frequency because it's honed into sound in a scalar field wirelessly. And of course Moscovium was discovered in Russia, or created by the Russians first. And the CRT, the cathode ray tube, came out in 1897 by the German physicist Carl Ferdinand Braun. And this is actually a type of particle accelerator, using a heat source to transfer an electron, or in this case many electrons, but ultimately it's in a vacuum. You can imagine what Bob was talking about. Inside here, there's matter and antimatter colliding, and it creates a lot of heat, similar to the face of a television or a CRT that's been running. But it gets a lot hotter than that. And solid-state transistor material, you could imagine, is on the face of it, transitioning that heat into electricity using a nuclear power source. So yeah, we basically got a crash course in this stuff. We didn't earn it. Now, we earned it over the time by backwards engineering it, but ultimately it was dropped onto us.